Okay, I think I'll start us off. So welcome everybody to the third of these GLACIER seminars. And we've been focusing on the relationship between policy and research, and we've had three very experienced academics across the three sessions who all have been working in different ways that interface. And I'm delighted today that we have Professor Kwame Akyeampong, who's from Open University, but currently at the Robert Bosch Institute in Berlin, who has had a long career while still incredibly young. A career in Ghana, leading educational research there, and then leading a range of programs and large projects from Brighton and from Milton Keynes and on secondment to various organizations around the world. And so Kwame has a very interesting story to tell about this relationship between being in academia primarily, but also working into a whole range of policy spaces and working with some of the big philanthropic and non-governmental organizations, as well as the international organizations, as well as organizations like FCDO. So really interesting range of types of organizations. But Kwame's going to focus, I think, primarily going to talk about this broader issue of translation, but to take a really interesting Ghanaian example as the heart of that. So I'm going to hand over to Kwame in a minute, and then he'll talk for 35 minutes, and then I think Michelle is going to come in at that point with some response. So Kwame, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Unfortunately, only virtually. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar series. I'm delighted to be able to present to you on a topic which is very dear to me, which is about education research evidence and how we translate that into practice. I had the opportunity to lead a team to develop a framework for embedding educational evidence within the Ministry of Education and for policymakers to use to inform policy. So what I'm going to do is to share what we accomplished as I led that team to introduce what we call the Ghana Education Evidence and Data Lab into the Ministry of Education and some of the issues that arose. Then I would end by talking about some of the implications, the challenges for how you actually take research evidence and you translate that into practice for use by policymakers. So thank you very much. I would okay. Can you? Okay. So what's the national landscape on education, evidence, and data? I think before we began the work, we did a survey and an exploration of the landscape. One of the things we found out was that in Ghana, we didn't have a national level platform that can take education research evidence and data and present it into one place to present to the ministry for it to access and use evidence for national policy making and this at school and district level also. I think this is quite common in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is an encouragement for policymakers to use evidence, but this platform, the space in which evidence can be actually accessed, doesn't exist. So we thought in Ghana, the best way is to really put in place the infrastructure, the structures that can make evidence much more available to policymakers and teachers and administrators. We didn't think the problem or the challenge was the evidence per se, which I'll explain later on. It was really whether the infrastructure and the systems are in place and easily accessible for policymakers. Secondly, we also found there are multiple sources of education data. I think if you looked at any country in Africa, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, Ghana in particular, you would find that they would have different sources of data, education data. And that fragmentation was not helping in decision making. Depending on where you look, you get a different set of data. So we wanted to really pull all of that together into one place. So why is the need for the GEEDLab? The GEEDLab stands for Ghana Education Evidence and Data Lab. So we wanted to create an evidence lab which would be address these issues. I think the first point I want to make is that like many countries, Ghana attracts a lot of interventions. So you can see that there are many programs that are doing research, many organizations doing research that are proposing solutions to education problems and challenges in the country. But there isn't any clarity on what works, why, and for whom. So there's a lot going on. We don't have a system where we can bring it all together and look at it. So as a result of that, policymakers are unable to know which education interventions are actually delivering improved learning, but also at costs that are scalable. I think one of the challenges that many policymakers face is that a lot of interventions are proposing solutions that are supposed to fix problems of education, but often they don't come with data on cost. And so one of the challenges that we thought we needed to address was how do we ensure that we are able to signal or provide evidence or education evidence that also includes cost on how you scale it, because that's what policymakers are interested in. How do you get the evidence across to or implement the intervention right across the country? Now, the other thing, which is earlier related to what I said, was that we didn't have a system in place that would get the evidence and data into the hands of policymakers, administrators, and teachers. But it also informs that they can understand and use for decision making. I think we have within the education space a lot of call for evidence to be made available for policymakers. But in what form should this evidence be, and how can they easily access it? So that's why we set up the GEEDLab. So what was the GEEDLab supposed to do? So there are 4 areas that we identified when we were setting up the infrastructure. One, we wanted to build a culture of evidence generation and translation. I think it's very important that evidence doesn't become something that happens as and when. We really were interested in ensuring that evidence can be part of how policymakers, teachers, schools think about improving their schooling or education or learning. We also wanted to connect researchers with experts, with decision makers, and practitioners. You would find that education researchers in Ghana have often not had access to the decision makers. Now, I'll explain why. Many of the interventions that are coming in are externally driven, and they are funded through external sources, and they have the first place when it comes to engaging with practitioners. The local researchers who are doing research do not often have that access to the practitioners and decision makers, even though they know the education system much more intimately than you would have external research organizations. The third thing is we wanted to identify the key problems and offer solutions to education challenges. So this was also very important. And then finally, to enable the ministry and the Ghana Education Service to use the data and evidence to improve learning for all children. So this was very important in terms of in how we went about building the structures. Now, this slide gives you kind of an overview of what the structure was. What we tried to do was, first of all, the GEEDLab, we didn't want an evidence lab to be set up outside the Ministry of Education. We wanted to use the structures that were already there, the systems that were already there, to if they were dormant or were not very effective, to activate them to make sure that they are fit for purpose. So the GEEDLab is situated within the Statistics Research and Information Management Unit within the Ministry of Education. And we offer training on how they can develop a repository, education research repository. We designed one and also offer them training on how they can use it. Now, it's important, if you look at on my right side, you have the Ghana Education Service. The idea was that once we provide the GEEDLab provides evidence on areas that on issues that or innovations, it has to be about innovations that can be scaled up. So it's important that it's at costs that are affordable. And then we also have the Planning, Budget and Monitoring Evaluation Unit that's responsible for policy. So the implementation arm of the education system in Ghana is the Ghana Education Service. So they take the evidence and they use it. The policy arm is the PBME. So they have to interact with the stream on the evidence that is generated. Now, if you look below it, you have the participating research organizations and teams in Ghana, but also external or international education research teams. And they are interacting with the GEEDLab at the ministry and also interacting across among themselves. So this is sort of, if you like, the general plan as we thought about how we set up the infrastructure or the system for using evidence to improve practice. So this is the architecture. The architecture is similar to what I've just shared, but I want to highlight two main components. One is that we have set up in Ghana what we call a high-level evidence education evidence committee, which is the steering committee at the Ministry of Education and GES. Now, they receive reports from SHRIM based on evidence that is demand-driven. The evidence is demand-driven because the ministry, we help the ministry to develop what we call a research and learning agenda. What are the research issues that are what are the problems that are confronting education in Ghana? And what are the questions that need to be addressed through research? So the research that is being done is in response to a research and learning agenda that the ministry, we've helped the ministry to set up so that we don't duplicate research that is already been done. We have consolidated a lot of the research that has been done to answer some questions and identified gaps that need to be addressed. So that has been the work that the SHRIM has been doing. It provides that evidence to the steering committee or the HILEC, and the HILEC shares that with the Ghana Education Service and the districts. The intention is that they would then help to translate this or into practice at school level. And then we have also established what we call the Consortium of Ghanaian Education Researchers. I think it's important that we get Ghanaian researchers researching Ghanaian problems, education problems. So a consortium has been set up. They are providing the research services for the Ministry of Education through the Statistics Research and Information Management Unit, addressing the research learning agenda. We have external research groups and organizations, and you see them there. I think the thing that this architecture does is to ensure that the Ghanaian education researchers are prominent in their engagement with the ministry in terms of offering research services. Often they lack capacity or very strong capacity, technical capacity as external research groups. So the intention is also for the Ghanaian education researchers to work closely with external research groups and organizations to build their capacity so that they can address the research and learning needs of the ministry. Now, the question, let me get to, I'm getting to the long part of my presentation, but this is very important. We've always kept in mind that the fact that you provide evidence doesn't mean that policymakers would use it. I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. And we have therefore focused on the structures, like I said, infrastructure, but we have also been addressing the question about demand for evidence. So the question we asked ourselves, will policymakers use robust evidence once you provide it to produce evidence-based policy? And this led us to ask the question, what drives education policy? And there are four areas that I think it's important to keep in mind that there are political ideologies that are important. When decision makers sit down to make decisions about education, they are not only considering the evidence that we provide them. When the HILEC sits down to talk about the evidence, we have to be aware that just because they have the evidence doesn't mean that they would provide it will lead to uptake. So we need to understand the political ideologies. There are also educational ideologies that it drives education policy. So we need to be aware of that. And then we have research. This is the bits that we are focusing on in terms of the GEEDLab. So the GEEDLab is providing evidence. And I think the funders and the global organization that are interested in promoting evidence-based policymaking often miss this element. The emphasis they often place is on the research. Assumption is that if you provide good quality research evidence, it will be taken up and used to improve education. And we, in designing the Ghanaian system approach, we were a bit hesitant on that. We said, one, the research evidence, there's a lot of research going on in Ghana. And some of it, we are not sure of the quality. All of them are saying they are providing answers. So we've got to figure out which is the best for Ghana. And that is why we have the research and learning agenda, to determine specifically what is it that is the gap in terms of the research we need to improve education. Now, once we've got that, we have to also engage with all of these other ideologies. So I think that what drives education policy is all of the above. It's not just it's political ideologies, education ideologies, and research. And we need to keep that in mind in setting up the structure. So in the educational ideology, it's important to keep in mind that sometimes you have, there is this often movement to create education that gives, that is often what we call student-centered focus. And this has been promoted time and again. And nobody's asking about the evidence. The assumption is that there's evidence. If you use a student-centered approach, students will learn. And that is often what is promoted. But what we don't ask is, how does it work out in a particular context, in the Ghanaian context, in the African context? And have we done enough research to understand what it actually looks like within that context and what form it should take to be able to have impact? So this ideology often comes, this idea of student-centered approaches to education, to learning, is on the back of evidence, perhaps sometimes that has been generated in other contexts and not in the Ghanaian context. So we need to question this when we have interventions that assume that it's student-centered approaches will lead to improved learning, when the evidence base is outside the context of Ghana. The other thing is enterprise. I think if you look at many education systems, Ghana included, the idea that education provides skills for a labor market, or it either develops people to be good or efficient workers, is inbuilt in the ideology. That education is about skills development. But what is the research behind it within the Ghanaian context? And we need to be asking those questions constantly. I think there's a third dimension that education is a force for positive social change. And if it is, what kind of evidence are we looking for in terms of that social change? And these ideologies are important because they embed the thinking of the innovations and interventions that are promoted in many systems, including Ghana. And often we don't think very much about them as having influence in the decision-making process. And we think this is important as we consider how the GEEDLab would provide evidence for use. And there are political ideologies. We know that. I mean, that there is an emphasis often on the how do we promote better quality and higher efficiency. That drives certain programs and interventions. And when we talk to policymakers and teachers in Ghana, a lot of the interventions that they are implementing makes assumptions about how they improve, how they provide better quality and higher efficiency. And yet if you ask what's the evidence behind it, there isn't much that is that people are aware of. We did a survey of teachers to find out what their needs are and where they look for evidence. And many of them were saying to us that when it comes to evidence, the idea of evidence is not simply what is published in an academic journal or evidence that is promoted through a program. Well, for them, evidence is what works for them in the classroom at the local context. So their experience of practice is also for them evidence now. So if you provide them with some form of evidence, then they can also relate with that when it comes to their own experiences of what works in their classroom. And this creates a very, sometimes very confusing environment for teachers, for practitioners to work. But I think the political ideologies are important because a lot of what the ministry and the development partners and organizations promote are based on some of these ideologies. And it's not very clear what is the evidence behind them. There is also, I think the social democracy is a big part of what we think is important. And I just talked about decision making in the Ghanaian context. When we talk to the teachers, a lot of what they are looking for, or where they access the evidence, is from their practice, or what is coming from their unions, the local education authorities, what local education authorities are telling them, or in collaboration with them are talking about. So those are all very important in terms of the evidence that they look for. But one thing that we don't often emphasize is the cost. I think there are a lot of interventions that are coming in Ghana, and we have made it very clear in the education repository that has been designed in Ghana that all the interventions that are being promoted, that are also saying that they have evidence, have to provide evidence about how much it costs. What is the amount of effect a particular intervention can achieve for the cost incurred to achieve a given impact? I think when we did a review of interventions in Ghana, we found very few that provided that answer, an answer to this question. So when we had our first HILAC meeting, we raised this, when we presented evidence of what can improve learning at basic level, foundational literacy and numeracy from a program. The question was, can this be scaled up across the country? And if it can, what does it cost? And many interventions don't include that. So to make policy, to make the evidence policy for policy uptake, we have made it a condition that the evidence that we look at or we review should have some cost data attached to it. So it also leads to the question of cost efficiency. What is the cost of producing the outputs? Unit costs for producing a particular output. These are questions that we have put on the Ghana Education Evidence Repository. In the call for research, we have said that please provide evidence on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness before that evidence is taken to the HILAC for them to look at it, so that we can talk about if we're going to scale this right across the country, or this particular intervention, this is roughly what we are looking at. Because the education sector is budget, in terms of finance, is heavily constrained. So the idea that you can say that, well, you can improve children's learning by introducing these programs, when you haven't talked about what will it cost to do it, what are the implications for actually delivering it, is something that we haven't often considered, and we've given this a very high priority when it comes to the repository that we've designed. Now, I put this in there because I think, just to give you an idea of what some of the challenges we face. Now, we know that effective schools research, this is from Larson in 2010, that has contributed significantly to discourse that teachers alone are responsible for student outcomes. Now, this is important because of that. A lot of the evidence that has been generated is linked to teacher action, teacher behavior, and student outcomes. Okay. Now, we think this is, we have to be careful with that kind of evidence, because in our research and learning agenda, we are beginning to understand that it is not only teachers who are responsible for student outcomes. So we need other evidence. So qualitative evidence is being admitted on the repository. We say we want contextual evidence, which would go with the other evidence for consideration. So if we have some evidence about teacher effects that can improve student learning outcomes, within the Ghanaian context, what are the additional qualitative evidence that we can help us to understand? What are the other factors that can produce effective schooling or effective teachers? So these are some questions that when we talk about evidence uptake or use or the production of evidence for policymakers, we also need to take that into consideration, because as I've underlined in this This is highly contextualized, complex, and adaptive nature of teaching when it comes to the set of skills that teachers need to produce learning. So it's important that happens. So in our repository in Ghana, we have quantitative evidence and we have qualitative evidence. The qualitative evidence is as much as possible trying to find research evidence within the Ghanaian context, which explains how teachers, students, families respond to learning and support learning, how they contextualize that. I think this is very important for us. Now, I don't know whether I'll be able to share this, but I have a couple, I think I have a couple of minutes, but this is an 8-minute clip. If it works, fine. If it not, I'll give you an idea what it says. But this summarizes the point I'm making, the arguments for and against low-fee private school in terms of evidence, ideology, and pragmatism. Let me see if it works. I hope it works. Can you hear it? You can't hear it. Okay, but you can see it. You can't see it either. Okay, I think I know why.
Right, no, not seeing anything, Kwame.
Okay, I'll stop sharing this thing, and I'll see if I try to share again, whether I can pick that one up.
Mm. Yeah, it looks like we've got a picture.
You've got it?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear? Can you hear?
No.
But you can see the picture?
See David's talking.
I'm sorry about that. It means you cannot. Can you hear?
I can't.
So basically, but you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me summarize it. This is a clip, and now the slides will be available so you can listen to it. But this is a clip which is looking at, you have 3 people who are arguing for and against research, the use of research evidence on low-fee private schools. And you can see that the issue of ideology, research evidence, and educational ideology is really at the core of what the discussion is. And I hope that when you listen to, you can see it really brings together some of the issues I've been talking about. That is a very complex issue. Let me stop sharing because you can't see it.
Okay, we've lost Kwame. Hopefully he will reappear in a second. Yeah, here he comes again.
Sorry about that. That's okay. So let me end here, and I'm very happy to take questions and comments from. Thank you.
Great, Kwame. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and really, particularly seeing it, an African example of a really sophisticated way of trying to deal with these issues that countries like Scotland might learn from. But anyways, thank you very, very much. I'm going to pass over to Michelle, if I may, who has some initial thoughts to get the discussion going.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kwame. As ever, that was so interesting and stimulating, and sparked a lot of thoughts. As you know, we've talked about some of these issues before, and share a lot of questions about how to manage these complexities. I particularly liked, some of the distinctions you made between supply and demand for evidence on the one hand, but also use. Use of evidence is different from demand for evidence, isn't it? Because, people can ask for lots and lots of evidence, but then only use what they want to use because they are driven by some ideology that weeds out evidence that doesn't fit that ideology. So that's when we get not evidence-driven policy, but policy-driven evidence. And we see quite a lot of that. So I think, that distinction between supply, demand, and use is important, and it's underpinned by some of these issues where there's a distinction between evidence, ideology, and pragmatism. So I found that really, really interesting. I was also really cheered, as this won't surprise you, to hear about space for qualitative research in all of this, because I think that kind of deeply contextualized evidence is what's often missing when people are looking for generalizable solutions. And, I was left with a number of questions that I've been wrestling with myself. I'm not expecting you to have some easy answers up your sleeve to these, but perhaps I can just pose them and you can address them if you want, or we can just let them float. But I mean, one of the questions, this is all towards better learning outcomes and improved quality, but to what extent, given these different ideologies and different understandings of evidence, to what extent is there a shared understanding of what are important learning outcomes and what does quality education mean? And I'm very interested in this question of scaling, and I know this is what's driving the international education community in a very big way. And I guess one question that I'm sitting on, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's one to reflect on, is national scale always the best scale to aspire to when we are looking for evidence and cost effectiveness? I mean, context is so important, and Ghana is a diverse place. Scotland is a diverse place. Many places are very diverse, some less so, some smaller spatially than others. But, there are political reasons for aspiring to the national scale. But do we need to rethink that? So those are just a couple of thoughts from me. And if you've got easy answers, that's great, because I've been waiting for them all my life.
Thank you so much, Michelle. These are brilliant questions. Let me start with the issue of scale. Now, a picture I didn't paint, which I think is quite common in many African countries, is a plethora of interventions right across the country. You can go into a district and you can have 3 or 4 interventions. You go to another district. So unfortunately, Africa is suffering from an overload of interventions. And the education system has lost control. In Ghana, we went to the ministry and said, do you know the interventions that are taking place within the country? Do you have data on that? No. If you go into the district, they have no clue. They know there's something happening here and there. The teachers are telling us that there are conflicting interventions taking place. Okay, so the space is very confusing. And in that space, you have global actors and development partners talking about evidence for scale. Now, which evidence are you talking about? And therefore, the reason why we felt that we needed to create the infrastructure, the structures, is to begin to interrogate these things. So every intervention that now will come to Ghana has to go to the GEEDLab so that there's a mapping of what is there. If you're having an intervention, you have to provide the evidence. The evidence can go into it. So it's okay, actually, this is in terms of learning, we have good evidence that it's working in maybe 3 or 4 or 200 schools, whatever it is. If that's what the highlight wants to promote, because we have a learning issue, then we can say that, okay, let's scale up. Now, scale up, when we say national, doesn't mean that it goes to every part of the country. It has to be targeted in that sense. But if we don't have knowledge about where the problem is, we can't scale up to those problems. And there's no way we can do that if we don't have an overview of what the country looks like. And I think there's too much talk about scaling up without understanding what it means in practice. And we've argued that unless you have the structures in place to tell you exactly where the problem is, the scale of the problem, scaling up is meaningless. So we think this should be something that we need to really emphasize. So I agree with you that there is this talk about scaling up evidence. I am not very happy with the way it's presented, because it's almost assumed as if you have some intervention that works, then you present it to them, we can then scale up. And some scaling up is taking place, frankly, in Ghana without consensus. Who gives you the permission to scale this up? I've been involved in programs that are scaling up. I don't think the ministry has given the go-ahead that is scaling up. So these are political decisions. There are political decisions that have to be taken. And that is why in the GEEDLab in Ghana, we have de-emphasized the research component. We have put emphasis on structures to make sure that we understand what it means if we want to scale up. So I think that we need to address, and I agree with you, that's a point that we need to understand. The issue about shared understandings of outcomes is also very important. I don't think we have consensus around that. A lot of it is driven by global actors and their understanding of what the problem is. We did a survey. One of the things we did, I said to when we were doing this, look, let's ask teachers. There's a lot of evidence we looked at that has been published. Let's go to the teachers. We did a national survey and asked teachers, what are the problems in your classroom? And then they talked about the usual things about literacy and numeracy. And I said, but we have been having interventions on this for many, many years. So what is it that you don't know? One of the things we found that they said there was conflicting evidence that is coming in. And an NGO will come in, will do something here, and that will also come to do something there. And often it's not very clear. You're using EGRA or EGMA to produce evidence about impact. The teachers are not really concerned about that. And in fact, when we asked them what they wanted, they didn't want evidence which says that if you do this, you can improve learning by this percentage. That's not what they wanted. In the repository, what they said is that they wanted to see video clips. They wanted to see steps. They don't want to see that this is the evidence. They want to say, okay, what lies behind these processes and steps, so that they can access that to improve their practice. So for them, evidence is not about some kind of data or information we say this works. It is actually something visual that they can use. So I think we need to have these conversations so that we understand exactly what we mean by these outcomes, what it means for the teachers, and how they can actually use it to improve learning. And there's a lot of assumptions about teaching at the right level. Teachers, we ask them, do you understand what it means? They have no clue. They know that teaching at the right level works, but what does it actually mean in practice? Where can they see an example of that evidence is lacking? So these are conversations that I think we need to continually have to clarify our understanding of what evidence is and how it can be used.
Great, thanks very much, Kwame. Ian, are we at the point where we can? Yeah, okay, thanks. You've answered my question. I can see a question in the chat from Colin Hykin. I don't know if there's anyone else who'd like to put their hand up. I recognise Colin's name from sort of UCFI kind of conference spaces. Do you want to ask that, Colin?
Okay. Is it the one?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, Kwame. It wasn't really a question actually, but it was the notion that you're saying about the reliability of the evidence if it's generated, as I said in my comment, in Europe, in North America. How does it translate into sub-Saharan context or any other context that is incredibly different to where it is generated? And so it was kind of, my post wasn't a question, it was more saying that's a very interesting take on it. Yeah. But it does lead us into the question, what can we do about it? Because we see it all the time. And a colleague of mine who's also on this webinar, she's raised it a number of times. Is what we're doing or is what we're seeing relevant if we don't have any data being generated from the area in which we're working?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Colin.
Okay.
Not a question, but it sounds like
I will address that.
Yeah.
One of the things we did when we were setting up the GEEDLab was to do a review, an extensive review of education evidence, learning outcomes that has been done in the last 20 years in Ghana, not only in Ghana, in the sub-region. One of the things that came out was TAL, teaching at the right level. There's strong external evidence about how TAL works. And then we looked at TAL in Ghana, which has been implemented. And then we saw that TAL was in the areas, in the regions that had been implemented, based on the external evidence that it works. After the intervention, when some research was done a couple of years, 2-3 years down the line, it was not effective. But when the teachers were not using it, you know. Yeah. So the evidence that was being generated that it works has to be linked to the context, linked to the, and therefore we are asking, what is it that you need to do to make it sustainable within the context? So TAL in itself there's no magic bullet around it. You have to take the evidence externally, look at the contextual factors that make it work. So a lot of the evidence that we were looking at were produced based on, and when the intervention had ended, we didn't know whether they were being sustained. And when we went back to some of them, they had been discontinued. Okay. And this is, so if you recommend TAL to be scaled up and you don't understand how it should be recontextualized, given the other conditions on the ground, you are not going to get the same effect that has been reported in the scientific research about its impact. And that is why we have said in Ghana that we do need to take seriously evidence in context. Even if it's worked in other contexts, we need to look at it in the Ghanaian context and research it to see what are the other factors that make it work more in one particular part of the country than the other. So this is the issue about the contextualization of evidence. So we do admit external evidence, but we've got to look at it within the Ghanaian context.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kwame. That was very useful. I have a hand up from Nicholas Novignon. If you'd like to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Nicholas Novignon, rightly pronounced. And thank you, Kwame, for that wonderful presentation. I think that, well, I can really relate with almost everything that Kwame has just said when it comes to uncoordinated interventions. By the way, I'm a student, I'm a candidate almost finishing up my PhD at Strathclyde, and I worked on inclusive pedagogy.
Right.
And so when Kwame talked about, evidence-based qualitative, I thought that my work really relates because I went into the classroom to see exactly what teachers were doing, and vis-a-vis the policy provisions, inclusive education policy provisions. And sometimes you see quite a lot of differences regarding what policy is demanding and exactly what is in the classroom, what teachers are actually doing. For example, policy talks about the use of the universal design for learning, which has been almost globally accepted as a way of promoting inclusion. And yet some teachers, they really had little or no knowledge. Some of them had heard about the UDL. The practicality of it in the classroom is something else. And so the point of contextualizing some of these policies. In fact, one of the issues that while looking through literature I found was that while the inclusive education policy was actually, piloted from 2003 up, one of the challenges, the biggest challenges that they found was that the whole project was uncoordinated. You have UNICEF coming in with, what they are requesting for. You have UNESCO also coming in, World Bank funding different aspects of the pilot study. And so there is so much about uncoordination within the Ghanaian context. I think that there is the importance of real harmony where things can be coordinated. So I really relate. yeah, I'm sure that I'm sure that it is not like something cannot be done at all. Like Kwame is saying, Kwame is something can actually be done. But what is more important is unifying whatever is going in, getting the decision from the teachers within the classroom. Because you see, I have had the benefit of, practicing as a classroom teacher and practicing as a special education coordinator, a resource teacher and a special education coordinator. And then now I am looking at, what teachers are actually doing within the classroom. So I have that benefit of what teachers are actually expecting to see and what they are looking for. Looking at it quite different from what is being pumped out to them. And you have decisions coming rather from the top a lot to the bottom, not thinking about what teachers are actually seeing as the real evidence for practice. And so this is a wonderful, a very powerful area. And we hope that this will generate more serious conversations that will lead to some of these aims being realized.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kwame.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. Good luck with the rest of your study. Kwame, do you want to come back?
Yes, I didn't focus my presentation on this, an aspect you've raised, which is very important. The GEEDLab is coming out of this movement for educational labs. I don't know, maybe some of you have heard about this.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in that, but I have been very cautious about it. It's one of those new fads that is coming now, educational labs, and the movement or this idea that the reason why we have poor education is because we don't have good evidence. It's a complete, we have to be very careful about that. I've been spending my time in Germany, like Simon, you said, and looking at the uptake of evidence in there. And it's, if not, it's not as simple as that, even in developed countries. So I have always said that we have to have a space. This is why in creating the GEEDLab, we had the HILEC, a space where we have conversations, okay? Conversations about evidence and other things. Because the assumption that you produce good evidence or robust evidence, and some policymaker who we don't know would sit somewhere and say, oh, this intervention is very good. I'm going to ask. It doesn't happen in the real world, and no place does that. And yet this movement about evidence generation for improving learning assumes as if once we have the evidence, people will just grab onto it. One of the things we found was that we are using AI to help to get our repository in Ghana right. If you think of a typical policymaker sitting in the office in the ministry, and you ask yourself, what is it that they need to know to take a decision? Often the evidence may be in a report. They don't read more than half a page, by the way. Many of them, if you present a graph to them, they don't have time for those things. So when we ask them, they actually don't have time to sit down and talk about the way we are doing things, like we're talking. So we felt that it must be easy to demand evidence. We are trying using AI with a repository where they can ask questions. Okay, I said to them, how are students who are in northern east of Ghana performing when it comes? What are the teacher, general? And then the AI generates it. So we've been working on that. So for them, that's how you get evidence, by asking the question and then providing some, can you get a graph which tells me how this region compares with that? That's the level of evidence they need, okay? They don't need some kind of statistical, that's the level of evidence they need. The classroom teacher doesn't need any more research evidence in the way in which we publish research evidence. They need something they can view. They need something they can access, tangible formats. So they've asked us that is what we need. So I think we have to be very careful with this whole movement about evidence. And there's so much evidence being generated. The problem is not evidence. Some of them is very poor quality. Some of them is good quality. But they're all there, And we think that the emphasis should be on the structures in the infrastructure that can filter the evidence and make sure that there's this discussion and debate on what is coming into the system. So in Ghana now, we are recommending that if you are starting an intervention, you sign up onto the repository. So we know you're doing something. And when you produce a finding, or you produce your report, it comes back to the repository. And the shrimp sits down to do a synthesis. We are training them for them to do a synthesis. And then that is also sent to the high leg. But it is being informed by the research and learning agenda. So not every research is what will be admitted. The ministry has come up with its research and learning agenda. So if you produce research that is relevant to that, then it also feeds into the discussion. So it's about the structures and the systems that we set in place that allows us to talk about these issues in a way that we don't often do, and we assume that is lacking, and that's why we don't have improved quality.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Kwame. As someone who's worked in a policy space for an African government, a lot of it really resonates with me. And I suppose one question that arises for me in this very current context of Ghana is, will there be political buy-in continue regardless of who the next minister is or the next Minister of Education is?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I'm very happy you asked that. When we were designing this, we were aware, this is why you have to take the political economy context. We're aware that we need to do something that is not at the level of the political elite or the political leadership. So we have worked with the technocrats and the people who are embedded, who work in the ministry, to set up these structures and systems. That is why in Ghana's case, we did not produce, we made it clear that we don't want to create new structures, new systems. When you go to many, these systems are there. They are not either not very effective or they're quite dormant. So we said, let's use the GEEDLab to reactivate them. And the Shrimp, as I said, has about 15 staff who are not doing very much in terms of evidence generation and use. So what we've done is to really, at the level of the ministry, people who already work in the units, use this to really give them something to focus on. So if there's a change, the research and learning agenda has been generated by the ministry itself, by the staff, with support from people from the university. So we've tried to keep things at the level which makes it possible for us to engage. And as some of you may know, Ghana is going to get a change in government, and we also have to navigate and see what are the issues, what are their manifesto issues around education and quality. How does it intersect with the research and learning agenda? The research and learning is an instrument that it needs to be revised time and again. It is not something that is set in stone. So it's an opportunity for new agendas to come in to see whether there's research behind those agendas and for dialogue. So we have created this research and learning agenda for dialogue, for discussion, so that we can have this conversation taking place all the time.
Great, thank you very much, Kwame. Looking for other questions. I'm looking particularly at the, I can see Michelle's hand. I was looking at the watch party. I think I might see Ellen's hand there. So maybe I can go to Ellen and now come to Michelle. Yeah, if we can get you unmuted. Okay. Whilst Ellen does some dance moves in the background by the look of it. I'll maybe go to Michelle and then I'll come back to Ellen. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm reluctant to dominate, but I will anyway. Kwame, I know we've sort of discussed this before. I'm aware, that there is conflicting evidence, but sometimes part of the problem is that the evidence already exists, but it's called different things. So, to me, teaching at the right level and structured pedagogy, probably two of the hottest pedagogical interventions on the planet at the moment, are very old news. But what we have is a new kind of evidence, because randomized controlled trials have been generating a particular kind of rigorous evidence that appeals to policymakers. So how does the lab deal with that?
Very good question, Michelle. One of the things that we did in setting up the lab is, like I said, to do a review of the evidence space and what teaching at the right level came up. And we interrogated it. We raised questions about it. You know, in the Ghanaian context, it doesn't seem to be working. You know, we questioned it. You know, not because the evidence from elsewhere is not, but within the context, it doesn't have long effects. So that is why, and then we also saw that there were a lot of contextual factors that raised questions about why we should do more qualitative research to understand why. Okay, so a lot of the evidence that we have looked at, you know, it's based on very short term, sometimes a couple of years. And we have made it very clear that's not enough. And therefore, we do need to look at bringing the local researchers. And actually, what the local researchers bring is what many interventions, the researchers do not bring. They know the context very well. They live in it, they go to schools, they engage, they have, you know, all kinds of knowledge about the system. And we are trying to privilege that within the pool of evidence that we're talking about, knowledges that are outside these, you know, RCTs are important. And these are driven by international organizations that have an interest in a certain type of evidence. And we say, okay, they're all right. And that's often what, you know, the government's ministries are listening to. That's why we've created the consortium of Ghanaian researchers, because they don't exist. They are fragmented. We don't have a community of Ghanaian researchers who are challenging this evidence based on research they are doing. So we are offering them training to do research, qualitative research, quantitative research, that can intersect with this kind of evidence that is coming in. At the moment, in many African countries, we don't have that community. So everything that comes in is accepted as something that is good for us. And I think this is why in our design, we have placed a lot of emphasis on the consortium. The consortium meets regularly to have discussions like this, to interrogate this, to allow them to talk about their own evidence and provide advice that can go to the ministry for them to, you know, critically look at some of this evidence that is coming in, because they are driven by other interests. And often they are not the kind of evidence that in practice will help the teachers, as we found out. It doesn't mean anything to them. Teaching at the right level to teachers doesn't really mean much. You know, they need something much more than that. It's good if you publish it as a research evidence and say these are what it be, you know. But in the Ghanaian context, we find that there are challenges that we need to address through other forms of research evidence. And the idea of what is evidence itself is also problematic. We are seeing that the teachers say, yes, they use evidence. When you ask them, nobody says, I don't use evidence to do my work. They wouldn't say that. If you ask them, well, I talk to my colleagues from the training I had that this method works, they see that all as evidence, you know. So we have to expand our understanding and what we mean by evidence so that we can address what is coming out often through the published literature about evidence and how it intersects with local context. We haven't done that sufficiently within the local context. And that is why we think the GEEDLab is the first step in creating that space for us to respond and react or engage with some of these ideas about evidence and how we can improve practice.
Thank you, Kwame. Looks like we're not going to get Ellen up and running and we're sort of out of time. So I think I will at that point say thank you so much to you. As often when you present things that I think, oh, that's a really interesting practical example of how to take something in a nuanced but powerful way. So thank you as always for giving me lots to think about. And I'd like to, you know, so I'd like to then close these 3 seminars. I found them all really powerful, so thank you, but Geeta and Steph before you. And then in the new semester, Glasgow only seminars, but a series of seminars. I don't know if Tora is in a position to just sort of quickly remind us of where we're going next. Or Matthew.
If Tor is able to jump in a second, that would be fantastic. But also for everyone else, if you're on social media, U of G GLACIER is on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. So please follow us for more information about forthcoming events. And I'll now hand it over to Tor.
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks a lot for an amazing session. Yeah, we start out with a new seminar series on the 22nd of January. With Glasgow staff, we have seven seminars lined up from January onwards, weekly seminars. And it's about difficult decisions to make in comparative educational and international education research, the dilemmas and strategies that we have as researchers. We start out with Simon actually on the 22nd of January, and then nearly every week there's a few breaks, but on to the 2nd of April, I believe, is the last seminar.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you, Kwame, for sharing your email there with Nicholas. So a final thanks to you, Kwame, for another, I say, wonderful seminar, and looking forward to catching up sometime as you come back to UK. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.